Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the warmth of your introduction. I'm very grateful. And yes, so you said that some of the thoughts in this paper emerged from my last book, L'Homme Saint. This is, in a sense, was written to revisit the argument of that book and, in a sense, have another go at it, see if I could get it right this time, or less wrong. So, yeah, this is, in a sense, sort of these are the afterthoughts in a way, or, as I say, L'Homme Saint revisited anyway. So yes, the politics of finitude. It's I should say as well that you'll notice there isn't a handout. This is because there aren't really any quotations. Or I think, reading through it earlier today, I spotted a couple. And one of which I translated into English, because I gave a previous version of this in a non-francophone context. And the other one I've left in French, but I think you'll probably be able to cope with that. Okay, it's only a sentence. So there aren't, but the fact that there aren't really any quotations will give you an indication of the kind of paper that it is, which is to say that it's very much a sort of discursive position paper, really. So, as it were, an overview of some of these problems. Okay. So, without further ado, to be human is to be finite. As Jean-Paul Sartre observed in 1945, as a human being, my existence is defined by my exposure to a threefold necessity. I am, by definition, for the time being, perhaps, obliged to be born, to die, and to find myself existing amidst a multitude of other finite beings. Moreover, as Jean-Luc Nancy in particular has subsequently insisted, pace Sartre, this finitude is not available for appropriation, either as a resource, as the foundation of a project, or as an object for consciousness or the will. This state of affairs presents us with a form of irreducible equality at the level of our existence as such, from which no one who lays claim to the name of the human is exempt, and which implies a relationship of solidarity with these other beings, especially those whose existence is exploited and brutalized in an abusive appropriation of finitude. Such, then, will be the argument of this paper, that the finitude which defines our existence in common can help us formulate the demand for an egalitarian politics. To recap, I've got 18 more pages on this, but that's it in a paragraph. But to recap then, by the simple fact of my existence, I find myself exposed to finitude. But this finitude is not mine, does not belong to me. Rather, it distances me from myself, opens an internal spacing as the very condition of my existence. Finitude here translates Heidegger's term Endlichkeit, and we should understand it not as boundedness or enclosure, but rather, as Nancy in particular has shown, as exposure to an inassimilable limit. In this sense, finitude differs crucially, as Henri Biraud notably pointed out, from what we might call finiteness, namely the cramped, confined, enfeebled existence which, in part of the Christian legacy, for example, defines the human creature as inadequate before the majesty of a God by whom this creature may or may not have been abandoned. Finitude as exposure certainly has its origins in this line of thought, as Biraud indeed demonstrated. And this vestigial connection to finiteness, while it understandably motivates the critique of philosophies of finitude, as we'll see, also offers these philosophies an unexpected resource and gives them, I will argue, a particular pertinence. The rethinking of Heidegger by Lévinas, Blanchot, Derrida and Nancy nevertheless operates a decisive break with these origins by shifting our understanding of the role of the limit. No longer boxed in by the walls of our metaphysical inferiority, we are faced instead with something like an infinitely receding horizon. Thrown, as Heidegger puts it, into an existence not of my making, I am faced by the unavoidable certainty of my death. Anticipation of this death is what makes it possible for me to grasp my existence in advance as the space of something like a meaning. As Sartre makes it most compellingly clear, anticipated death makes possible my existential project. But even in this strongly dialectical version, death is not assimilated as such. It is not an encounter with, still less a crossing of, the limit that allows me to leap forward into the future, but rather my understanding of my existence as defined by its exposure to this limit, which I will never experience, which, as Lévinas and Blanchot particularly insist, will never form the object of my consciousness or my will. To be finite in this sense is to have one's existence defined, happily, as exposure to a constitutive outside which will never be colonized. Exposed to an unattainable limit, then, and those who dislike the language of finitude will find this a typically miserable formula. But what this criticism misses is that this structure can equally well be described as a kind of unboundedness. The limit as limit never arrives. Finitude, here, is thought not as deprivation, but as opening. This understanding of finitude, encapsulated in Nancy's late formulation of what he calls infinitude, represents to an extent a contemporary avatar of a tradition of thought according to which the human is defined by its constitutive insufficiency. But this is an avatar in which the negativity of this insufficiency is for the most part replaced by an affirmative sense of exposure. I say for the most part, as I will nonetheless be wanting to hang on to a little of this negativity, as we will see later. It is not without its uses. Some key moments in the unfolding of this tradition would include Plato's account in the Protagoras of the story of Prometheus and Epimetheus, in which, as Bernard Stiegler has shown, technicity, in the form of fire, is granted to human beings by Prometheus as a kind of originary prosthesis to make up for his brother's failure to endow them with any specific attribute. Would also include Pico delle Mirandola's On the Dignity of Man, in which this lack of specific determination calls the human creature on to a kind of self-fashioning. Also, the direct inheritor of this thought, namely Rousseau's definition of the human in terms of perfectibility, and even the modern biological notion of human neoteny, the persistence in the reproductively mature adult form of the species of characteristics associated with its juvenile stage of development. The major difference presented by this understanding of finitude in relation to this tradition, however, is that, as we saw above with reference to its existential version, the openness or indetermination in question is no longer recycled as the motor for some further growth. The constitutive outside to which I am exposed as a condition of my existence remains beyond me, and, rather than a lack spurring me on in my project of self-perfection, this exposure can now be affirmed as such, as, precisely, an exposure in common. It does not belong to us and cannot be made the object of our projects or our productive activity, but it defines our existence as existence in common. Not held in common, our existence is not our possession, collective or otherwise, but we exist in common, radically equal and in the midst of one another, whether we like it or not. So finitude becomes political, accordingly, inasmuch as this equality of existence provides a yardstick by which to denounce any concrete inequality. This is true of any understanding of ontological equality, of course. But understanding this equality in terms of finitude allows us to go further than a merely formal, abstract denunciation. For the exposure which defines our relation to finitude is also materially manifest, in travestied form, in the suffering of the exploited, subjected to the exploitation not just of their labour power, for example, but of their existence as such, invited, for example, to rent out their body as a site of medical experimentation. This exploitation represents the abusive attempt to grasp, to render physically present, and to extract profit from that existence as exposure which by definition is not available to this or any other form of appropriation. This is indeed what defines the injustice of exploitation as such, its attempted appropriation of the ungraspable exposure which defines our existence in common. Its attempt, that is, to make the encounter with the limit happen. In and against the attack on this existence that we call exploitation, this attempt to colonize and to produce our constitutive exposure is already revealed as injustice. And the constitutive, ungraspable exposure which defines our existence places us already, by virtue of this definition, on the side of those whose existence finds itself under attack. This is what Nancy means when, In Vérité de la démocratie, he disputes Badiou's formulation of what Badiou calls the communist hypothesis. Communism is not a hypothesis, says Nancy, but what he calls our first given. We are in common. The task, Nancy continues in Rousseauist and Nietzschean vein, is to become what we are. It is moreover important to appreciate that this revelation is immanent to the process of exploitation. It is not dependent on any positive ability on the part of the exploited. Not that such ability is ruled out, far from it. But we have seen and continue to see forms of exploitation which are characterized by their determination to strip those they attack of any positive attribute, including the capacity to act. At this point, in the face of such undertakings, we have a choice to make. We can agree that the dehumanization they desire to bring about has effectively succeeded, abandon its victims to their subhuman fate, and concentrate our energies on those whose ability to act remains intact. Or we can refuse this nonsensical idea of some kind of subhumanity, which is ruled out by the fact of our existence in common, and confront the exploitation in question with, and where necessary, for those whose existence is under a form of attack which cannot be other than unjust. This understanding of an immanent demonstration of the injustice of exploitation can be found, for example, in Sartre, for whom the existence of the exploited multitude already represents what he calls the radical demand for the human in the midst of an inhuman society. It is most thoroughly and most acutely developed, however, by the French resistant, communist and concentration camp survivor Robert Antelme. In L'Espèce humaine, his 1947 memoir of his experiences, Antelme analyzes the attempted dehumanization operated by the concentrationary system. The victims of this system are stripped of all the attributes that might be thought to characterize a human being, just as their oppressors desire. Contrary to this desire, however, this subtraction from the human of all its distinctive properties does not in fact open a breach within humanity, by which the truly human might think to separate themselves from the supposedly subhuman. In a defiant reversal, Antelme insists that what is revealed by this erosion is not the subhuman, but rather the exposure to inappropriable finitude, which defines the human as such. When the victim dies, and she will, she dies as a human being, not as something else. The oppressor will have failed in his wish to have his victim change species, for, with the irreducible force of the weakest residue, the human, as exposure to a limit which can never be appropriated as such, is inevitably affirmed in and against its attempted abolition. The oppressor's attempt to realize the encounter with the limit is bound to fail. Existence is not available for appropriation in this way, and it is the denial of this fact that defines the injustice of the oppressor's project. What Antelme allows us to see is that the end will not come. There is no encounter with the limit, and that this unboundedness already indicates a possible force in the struggle against oppression. Now, this position in broad terms is better known, of course, as that of Primo Levi, whose If This Is a Man was, like Antelme's memoir, also first published in 1947.